how do we really plan for risk? And we have a very diverse group here today, just from cities and members to our departments, from first responders to public works to finance to risk managers. So we all have to start looking at how do we look at the same thing and how do we then convey that departmentally? All right, so are we ready? I told you that we were going to pump this all day long. We'll have AC/DC themes going as much as I can work them in. Okay, I said there was no judgment zone, right? Now the first slide says judgment zone. Today's a no judgment zone, but make no mistake that those of you leaders, the civic leaders of your organization, of your community, you will be judged. And you're going to be judged on your preparedness and how you respond to an event after a loss. Your constituents, your community, even your various staff members expect you, if you're the one that wears that lucky hat, that I'm sure you get compensated for one of those roles that now you take on, how you attack risk, how you ensure risk, and how you respond to risk. There has to be a plan, okay? So we'll talk about that, and more than ever, I think that last point is so big. It's the 24/7 visibility that we just seem to have. Every year I think, well, we can't have more visibility. And then every year it just seems like we have more visibility. So transparency, visibility is a great thing when we all talk about it. It's just not always a great thing when transparency and visibility deals with our personal space, our work product, and what we're doing. So we all are going to be judged at some point when it comes down to our preparedness and our ability to recover after a loss. So if we spin that risk, the cost of risk, understanding, and if risk were a game. Now here's where some of you know that we used to have all these fun videos and funny videos, and we've had to dial back on some of our levity and some of our ways of which that we communicate disasters. Understand that I'm not right. Many of you know that it takes a village. That's why there's 17 Florida and FMIT staff here to either write down what I've said or to cut me off, when we start saying things. So, if risk were a game and we had to spin that wheel, because guys, at some point, you're spinning the wheel to see what risk is coming up and how are we prepared and what steps are we going to take. Because at the end of the day, we're talking about lives, property, and money. And while we can be challenged with all of the different exposures that we have, and we could all say, if we had the budget for it and the people, we could plan for everything, right? We're challenged for that ability. So this year, what are we playing for, or what's at stake? Well, the most prominent is we just talked about. We are already, in just the beginning of June, already have now our second named storm, and it's now approaching the Gulf. We've got about a 50% chance of development further into this week. Our earlier models indicate that we see a fairly reliable track that's going to bring it up into the mid-central part of the Gulf. Looking again at the typical early storms we see, but usually later in July and August, that start threatening the Texas coast, Louisiana, and then the skirts of Panama City. But all bets are off. What we just know is probability. So as we plan our risk and exposure, we're looking at our probability of exposure. Where's this storm going? What do we need to start doing now? So obviously, if Jim Cantori shows up on your doorstep, or you turn on the news and see that he's at your beach, right, Cocoa Beach? We went through that. Loved seeing Jim Cantori on the back of City Hall. That's usually not a good indicator that you're outside of the cone of uncertainty. When Cantori shows up, you are typically viewed as ground zero. All right, so again, for the storm seasons, what are you playing for? We'll talk about some of these different programs, from emergency protective measures and services, all the way down to the various FMIT claim workflow, to some of the programs that are there to help you through with response and recovery. The pandemic, gosh darn it, we learned a lot from that, didn't we? A lot of us learn now the appropriate attire and backgrounds for our Zoom calls. That's a big one. So if anything, we really learned our remote workplace. We learned how to communicate, sometimes in an environment that was less ideal, that normally had us all sitting around, across from each other. So how are we taking those lessons learned to adapt that into the next pandemic, right? Some would argue that we're still in the pandemic. I'll leave that to you and your city on how you're still addressing COVID-19 from some of the PPE or some of the protocol. We'll talk about that here in planning. That's important too, that you start communicating with us on how your city's going to move forward or is moving forward. More importantly, if the hurricane were to happen here, how are we to interact? Right? What's our call to action during this? If we're integrating with you at your EOC, what do you want to see? So that we can make sure that we build that protocol within your specific plan. Okay? We still go to places that are still on lockdown. And we show up and it's like, oof, man, I'm sorry. I guess we didn't really understand how you were handling this. Okay? So again, this is sharing is caring. Power outage. Now I got way off track on the last one, so I'll apologize in advance as I go down that same railroad track. Guys, this is our biggest concern right now. Homeland Security, all of our DOD, this is what's got everybody's attention. You want to Google it now, go on, look at what our Secretary of Energy, everyone else. We saw this happen in Texas with the freeze. Y'all heard all the stories that came out of that on a prolonged power outage. Now, while many of us are not concerned with the freeze here in Florida that may replicate this type of exposure, a hurricane, right? A wind event does the same thing for us. And many of us have been down that path of an extended power outage. What we're extremely concerned on, as we all know now with the malware and some of the cyber terrorism, or however we want to call what these security breaches are, we are more susceptible than ever. And it's not that these guys are brilliant or these people are brilliant. It's through our own errors. It's through our own sometimes failure to recognize the exposure. You know, on our pipeline breach, as it's now come out, it wasn't some guy that graduated from MIT that figured out an algorithm to do this. They got into an outdated employee password on a VPN network through a back door. A fairly simple thing that if we had security in place to do that. But guess what? After COVID, before COVID, we weren't as tied into all of our critical information as we are now, right? So with every situation that we then maybe improve to or develop, comes a whole new set of sometimes challenges and risks that maybe we weren't aware of. So now I would encourage all of you that as we start learning, the power outage is something that I cannot preach enough to all of us, that without power, it doesn't really matter what kind of plans we have. And right now, our Northeast grid is extremely vulnerable, and we are doing everything we can at this point to, and when I say we, because we sit on some national committees, and we're working with some governors, and we're working on infrastructure improvement. And then anytime you start talking about that, you're bringing in a whole political sphere to that, and that's been a whole challenge as well. So enough on the power outage. Oh, you can even see a little note that they put up on the screen to drive that home. A new exposure. Exposure some of us had to deal with. If you're down in our south with the city of Parkland, we all unfortunately knew that story. But so many of us, just from the time that we create this slide, we wake up every morning with a new event, a new issue that we're faced with. And you as public entities and public domain, gosh darn it, we are being challenged more than ever and faced in the morning with a shooting at our public works or our rail yard, or now a fire station where a disgruntled employee showed up. So now this is coming out of maybe the community that we were concerned enough on, and now into your workspace. So this is a big area. As we talk about exposure and what we're planning for, this is one that we're all having to pay greater attention to, especially in an economic downturn or just tough times. Just unfortunately does things to people that you'd say, what do they always say about an individual in a workplace violence? Boy, he was never violent. He was the nicest, or she, or were the nicest people. So it can happen to any of us. So it's really now, how are we addressing this within our workspace and our environment? And then we talked about the data breach, the experiences. We hosted about 70 cities in the south here, down at the city of Sunrise. And a couple of our members there have really gone out and have really put together and developed and working with Chris Smith and the FMIT claims team off of what happens in a cyber breach. And this is where I'm not smart enough to even talk more on this subject, but it's something that obviously we now understand vulnerability. It's something that the FMIT has really been a leader in the industry of going out there and doing the best we can in the space that we're in to figure out which coverages that are available and which coverages the league can continue to push. So if this is something that is right up there on your meter, then I would encourage you to pull John Ligon aside and Chris and the team and have that conversation if it's something of concern to you. And it's something that if we're still maybe missing the ball on it to some extent, we need to hear from you because, again, as a greater membership, it's the pulse. What is it? Where are we at? The product that we're offering now, does that address what your needs are? If you're not speaking up, guys, sometimes, we then lack that on our end, all right? Whoop, went back. And then old Steve Harvey, the unthinkable, right? Now, we look at that picture, and we used to think of that's comedy. Besides, I think that's a dinosaur in the bottom column. I think we're still probably not there yet. Everywhere else, volcanoes are not prevalent in Florida, so I would assume all of you that's low risk. But our flying drones, we see that, especially nowadays. The zombie attacks are just that. I guess that's possible. We have space stuff falling from the sky, and according to our Navy and pilots, we have a lot of unidentified flying objects nowadays. So again, the hope for many of you, and maybe it's worked, but it seems like a lot of our civic leaders, when bad things happen, when do they happen? Friday after 5 on extended weekend. So if that's your game plan, that when it happens, I'm on vacation, and that's working for you, great. But somebody else is wearing that hat, we probably need to think through this a little bit up. Coming up with a general plan of attack. And guys, we have some members that are so proud, as what we'll talk about, our coop plans. If you know what coop plan is, it's not a chicken coop. When I say that, some of my folks out in the rural areas start asking interesting questions that we start going down really the wrong path. The coop plan here is our continuity of operations plan. All right, and some have multiple books, biblical proportion, in dedicated shrines. We're Cliff Note readers in the emergency service business. If you think that we're going to be able to show up and comprehend what your plan is from cradle to grave, probably not going to work. So what we need to do is have something that is easily understood by new folks in the engagement of this so-called fluid event. So Cliff Notes and bullet points work very well. So we'll talk about just some things, and I will share with you what some other members have put together to help some of us, at least in this space, where we're part of your response team to your insured property, how you can help us and put us in a position to succeed rather than fail, okay? So are we ready? So today, before lunch, we'll get through some of this. If you're just going to stand up here and watch me try to entertain you and talk, we may get through this pretty quick. If you see some areas again, please feel free to stop me, interject, and we'll spend some time. So we're going to talk here on understanding basic risk assessment. Not going to spend a lot of time on that. Updating your BCP COOP plan. Again, we're going to hit home on some of the key things and really what we in the FMIT have put together for you and some of the resources that are there to maybe slide into your plan. Or maybe it's something to help kickstart some discussions with your team and your departments. Accounting for cost recovery, how do we pay for this? Everyone can recover if we didn't have restricted budgets and money. So we'll talk on some creative programs that the FMIT has led the municipal market in putting out there. And that will be something that I will make sure you're taking notes on. Because there's nothing that's harder on any of us, especially in the claims department, when we have fought for some unique coverage extensions and nobody's using them. So then we look at ourselves and go, I guess we're not doing our job of communicating these other lines of coverage that come with the policy, right? And if you're not using them, guess what? We end up losing them because our reinsurance partners and our stakeholders are saying, well, why are we giving you all this lines of endorsements and coverages? You don't use them. And then we're arguing about, well, I guess we're not communicating well enough. These are there for your departments to also use these. So if we can convey them to Public Works, your first responders, there is a huge resource of money, but there are some restrictions, there's some timelines, there's some things that we've got to be aware of to take advantage. So we'll talk about that, and then last but not least, we'll do a quick Insurance 101, FEMA 101, guys, departmentally, from executive on up to executive leadership. These are some basic things you got to know. They sound stupid, but guys, sometimes we're looking at each other going, where did we miss the mark? All right? Then we'll have lunch. We'll come in off of lunch, and then we'll go through before and after landfall. This will be what our plans are in support. If you're receiving those FMIT alerts, if you've been part of the ride-out teams, if you've done some of that, this will be a quick refresher. If that stuff's new to you, then it'll probably be a good, worthwhile discussion and review. And then last but not least, the turnkey recovery program that the FMIT has continued to instill. It's now written language in the policy. We've done some extra steps in working with both FEMA and FDM, which is the Florida Department of Emergency Management, to get some other means to make sure that when FEMA comes knocking and we're dealing with the various consultants and the various third-party folks that you hire or your teams hire, that they're not trying to work against the programs that the FMIT has put out there that are eligible. Now, they're very unique. So, you know, when these 1099 consultants are coming in town, they're doing the very best job they can to protect you and your city from yourself. So when they're following the Stadford Act or these guidelines, yes, that language can seem to work against what FMIT has put together. But that now has been validated and solidified by some approaches. So we'll talk about it, and we'll show you what some other members are doing to also help solidify that as one of their tools in their tool chest. Okay? So back, are we ready? Understanding basic risk assessment. I say the tale of two cities. This is just a quick, I call the vocabulary of risk. We call it a lot of different words, and today I'll probably jump around already, as you've heard, and I'll refer to it as a lot of different things. I think I have a pointer here even. Yep. Disaster, emergency, crisis, hazard, incident, event, loss, claim. They all kind of mean the same thing. Risk equals a hazard that can negatively impact your organization's operations and insured asset property. So that's how we're going to focus the discussion today, is really on your insurable assets, those things that are in your insurance policy that really we're responsible to you for the premiums that you pay. Risk obviously is spread out over all those other things that you deal with, okay? So we'll talk some generalities, but to allow me the ability to be selfish, and what I'll be kind of tying the message to together is your assets, your buildings, your vehicles, your assets, okay? And how we can do a better job of supporting when those assets are damaged, and those are critical components to your operations. That's where we step in, so that then you can rely on us to help you help yourself, right? And then you can spend more of your time on all the other risk and exposure and duties that you have to your community and your cities, all right? Let us take some of that weight off your shoulders. So when I always say the tale of two cities, what's the difference? I always say that it's one's ability to respond and recover in a timely and economic way, right? That what might happen to one member who maybe has the capacity, the financial resources, the experience, that may just be an incident to them, while if that same loss or exposure were to happen to another member, that may be one of those other words that seems to be more critical. Disaster, emergency, crisis. And those of us in this business, we become callous to losses. They happen every day. They go around us each and every day. We can't prevent them, and we're exposed to them whether they're here or somewhere else. So we've just about seen everything. From recovering 9/11 after the Pentagon, to working with Christchurch, New Zealand after the earthquakes, to handling NASA over in Cocoa when we had a large incident in our life science building, and we had to keep 2 space shuttles operational, and a animal care facility, and moon rocks, and the other things that those of us in the risk side of it didn't really know what we were even insuring in these buildings, right? So they all have a different meaning to some. To some of our members, a toilet overflow on that second floor is a disaster. It's reached their ability, their capacity to address that. While someone else with a different staff or other capacity, like I said, it's just it's a nuisance. It's something we just have to take care of today. So again, today, each disaster has its own set of circumstances. It's fluid. So these words are all interchangeable, all right? Are you and your organization ready for the unexpected? And that's really what we're saying. A hurricane, folks, is what? It's really a planned event. It's the one disaster out there that we really get a warning of. And sometimes we are still missing the boat on that. We get a 5-day track. We get a 3-day track. Granted, there's a lot of stuff for us to be planning for. But if we're not planning for hurricanes and maximizing our ability there in preparedness, how about all these other things that just happen without notice? Okay, so, and that's part of what I call risk management and risk mitigation. It's risk management is how am I going to manage our plan? Risk mitigation is one of those steps that a lot of us just don't have the liberty to take a lot of time in. How do we sit in a room? How do we game plan? How do we figure out how to mitigate before something happens? How can we make our property more secure? Boy, that takes a lot of time from, I know, a lot of other things that you're doing. But those are things that we always want to challenge ourselves with. So hazards come in many different shapes and sizes. They're influenced, like we said, geographical conditions. Maybe what we're more concerned with down in South Florida maybe not be the same hot button here on the central side or as we go up north. As we get to Tree USA, right, Dade City, one of our biggest concerns up there is going to be wind and fire, right? Two big events. And then the other thing, so how we prioritize those things. Flood. Now, sinkholes may not be a big threat for some of us in South Florida, but when we get up around certain parts as we start moving west into the Ocala area and Denellen and right, who else is concerned with sinkholes? That is. So it's geographically, climate and weather obviously, and this isn't an Al Gore speech, so I'll move on from climate and weather, caused by people. That's another. Last but not least, just the extraordinary phenomenon, things that just happen that were once the unthinkable, now they become commonplace. And we're starting to see that in some of the other risks and exposures that we're seeing. So, what real risks are you guys planning with? Did I miss anything? Please don't raise your hand and say mudslides. We had that in the last one, and I couldn't help from picking on the person that said mudslides, because that was a new one to me. Anyone else, realistically, in your area that we're really planning on some other risks, maybe some ones we didn't cover? Okay, so pretty topical. I did have a stampede as one, so if you do have cattle, sorry I didn't give you the prompt where you're supposed to follow the prompt, and that's that subliminal messaging we do behind all the slides where we tell you to buy popcorn, eat popcorn, raise your hand and provide an answer. Okay, so here's what the state of Florida, here's what Florida Department of Emergency Management, here's your counties. When we aggregate this data up, and we want to, from a state standpoint, from both funding and from their COOP plans, this is their top 15. Both from frequency, probability, and then you've got how that affects the three categories, and then overall vulnerability. Okay, you can see very likely is annual. Likely means every 5 to 10 years. Not likely is 50 to 100 years. So flood throughout the state continues to be our number one exposure from top to tip across the board. Named storm, cyber incident now has creeped up to number 3. Severe wind or hail, that would be any kind of wind event that many of you up here that I'm learning after 3 o'clock, there seems to be a wind, a microburst, something that comes to the Orlando area. That's moved up. Transportation incident, terrorism's at 6. And then we start moving into then all of these different geographical type. And if you can see down there, we've got space weather events has moved up to 13 for falling debris. And when I looked into that, because I was just interested, it's for those of us in the Space Coast with a lot of now the commercialization of space, the amount of rockets that have become common to us that before we all celebrated each time there was a liftoff, right? Now, Cocoa Beach is complaining about the noise every day because it's just seeing SpaceX and everybody is seeing how fast every day we can keep launching stuff. So space weather events are something now that the state has started to look at and started to be more prepared at, vice versa, okay? So what that helps us do is define our risk appetite. What are we as an organization? Maybe what is you and your department? What's critical to you? What are you willing to accept? And if we don't know that, then we're really already put in a position to fail. Our ability to plan for risk, and planning for risk, as we'll talk a little bit more, also means how do we insure that risk? Are we insured correctly? Are you over-insuring? Are you under-insuring? There's no better person at looking at that than your departments. You know, those of you that are risk managers and finance directors, this sucks. Right? You're asked to be this fortune teller on things that you don't always even know that it's, I hear across the board, and I'll let John, if he wants to stand up and blast out a new answer, but a lot of times we'll hear from departments or we'll hear from our risk manager finance going, yeah, they don't tell me when they build something new, or yeah, they didn't tell me we just did that, or yeah, I didn't know they eliminated that building. Now, I don't know if that sounds familiar to you. I see some nods. It happens. And communication's a great thing when it works and we're holding hands singing Kumbaya, but that's just not life, right? So we have to find a way that we can then maximize our ability to better understand how are we going to be judged. And I'll tell you, we had an incident at a high rise. This wasn't in Florida, where this was a number of years back. There were a lot of fatalities that happened in a fire, whereby when folks were evacuating the building, and they do these drills once a month. They do fire drills once a month, okay? But at the end, what happened, I'll skip to the end, we'll go back. People died, they were trapped in a building. What they didn't realize is, in one of the stairways that they would exit the building in, the door's locked and secured behind them as part of a firewall and a part of a way to secure it. So folks became trapped in the stairwell. They couldn't go up, they couldn't go down. Fire's coming up, they'd go up, they couldn't evacuate the stairwell, and they died of smoke inhalation and everything else. Was that preventable? Yes. The appetite for risk that the person in charge was willing to do was, well, we're going to hold an exercise, but we're just going to just kind of go out this door, show you what it looks, go back in. When they interviewed everybody, it wasn't that somebody was just careless and not realizing the risk. It was they didn't have the money and the time to continue to do a full-blown exercise, whereby you would hope if you replicated that from start to finish, perhaps one of those times someone would have realized, man, our doors are locking behind us, what happens? So somebody had to make that decision when they told the guy, hey, we're not paying for all that, spending too much time. So that manager did the very best they could at what resources they were given. That is unfortunately part of our plan. And if you're in charge of that plan, then you better know what that tolerance is and document it. Else you're going to be the one with your target over your head, because again, they're going to come to the person who helped initiate that plan. All right. Again, it's determine the likelihood. So while that's an extreme example, that risk appetite is there. And if you as a department head or a staffer don't know what the city's expectations are, how can we really plan?